Good evening and good morning, everyone. My name is Holman Oh. I am a second-year MBA student at London Business School and also the lead organizer of the Global Energy Summit this year. This year looks like we will have a full house today with over 800 registered attendees from 67 different countries. Thank you all for coming to this event. As a quick preview of the three-day session that we have prepared for you, today we'll focus on the shifting landscape in the energy sector. Tomorrow, we'll dive a little bit deeper into understanding its impact on the Middle East specifically. And on the last day, we'll go on and explore distributed solar as well as different storage technologies. Whether you are a industry profession or a student, we hope that you will enjoy these discussions. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dean François from the London Business School. François, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much and a warm welcome to everyone. I am so happy that you are all taking the time to participate in this event. I don't think I need to remind everyone why it is so important for leaders like you to come together, to exchange ideas, to explore the current challenges and to explore opportunities as well. We know about climate change, we know the role of energy in the transition that we will face as humans. And then if any of us had forgotten or if we are worried that people were not aware how important these conversations are, well, the recent event in Texas offered a reminder, and I hope that they offered an opportunity actually for the energy sector to help educate the world about how important energy concerns are and the importance of reshaping the sector for the world that is fast evolving for us and with us. At LBS, we really pride ourselves in the students we attract, and I hope that you will experience the quality of the students who participate in our programs and who organize such terrific programs. The speaker lineup is outstanding. Thank you to all the speakers who are coming here. And I'm so impressed by the number of participants and all the countries that are represented here and will be represented over the coming days. But you see, what makes the value of LBS as a convening platform is not just the quality of the organizers or students of ours or the quality of the speakers, is the outstanding diverse perspectives that we bring together again and again in our forums. And that doesn't come to life if you don't participate. And so I hope that you will make the most of the technology to engage with one another, participate and exchange ideas. We really thrive at LBS when we allow minds to come alive and ideas to connect and to collide. It's important to us as a school, it's important to all of us as human beings in this challenged world that we are in today, because you are all in a position to make a difference around you in how is it that we will manage that energy transition, be it in shaping the future for all of us, be it in managing the transition in the Middle East or exploring ways in which solar technology and battery technology can make the world a better place. But you all have an impact because you also can participate with us in the education of the world within your organization and your social networks. We are hard at work at LBS to help facilitate a better world for us all. You're experiencing the best of our students. Our research are also working on energy-related topics. Just this morning, I was closing a training program we did at Saudi Aramco, a program in strategy and finance for a good number of their emerging leaders. We at LBS, we want to be part of the conversation. Is part of our purpose to have a profound impact on the way the world does business and the way business impacts the world. And again, the way we do this is by convening outstanding people like you, diverse minds, help them connect and have their ideas collide. So I invite you all to enjoy our speaker. Again, big thanks to all of you, to enjoy what our students have organized, and big thanks to them for their leadership, and most importantly, to enjoy one another. Again, welcome to this summit.
Thank you, Dean Francois. Hello, everyone, and good evening from London. Welcome to LBS's GES Day 1. I'm Miles Coleman, a Masters in Finance student here at LBS. We're really excited to have you all on this call, and it's our pleasure to introduce our distinguished speakers tonight. So tonight will consist of two sessions. The first with our keynote speaker, and the second with a panel where we'll be covering the latest trends in the energy transition. There will be 10 minutes for Q&A at the end of each session. So do post your questions as they come up, and we'll do our best to cover them in the Q&A. Without further ado, I'd like to first introduce our keynote speaker, Mark Vyvyan-Robinson, and moderator, Marco Duso. So, Mark Vyvyan-Robinson is Director of Solar and Onshore Wind for EDF Renewables. He is responsible for the company's solar and onshore wind development activities in the UK. Previously, Mark has worked in a number of commercial and strategy roles for EDF Energy, and his early career was with Shell. Mark has a full-time MBA from LBS and studied engineering at Cambridge. Marco Duso is a principal at BCG London with a leading role in BCG's Centre for Climate Action. He is a World Economic Forum Fellow on the topic of climate action with multiple publications, including the Net Zero Challenge. Other work outside BCG includes experiences at Shell and Equinor. Marco graduated not too long ago from LBS with an MBA. Mark and Marco, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Okay, can you see my slides? Great.
Yep.
Okay. Well, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak tonight. It's a great honor to speak in front of you all. What I'm going to spend my time talking about is I want to give a bit of a reflection on what's happened since I left business school. I'm then going to talk a little bit about some of the challenges facing the key renewable energy technologies. And then I'm going to reflect a little bit on the future. But before I go into that, just very, very quickly, a couple of slides on who I am and EDF. So I work for EDF Group. EDF is perhaps more famous for being the largest operator of nuclear power plants in the world, but we also happen to be a very large renewables developer. So we operate in 22 different countries. We operate 10 gigawatts of onshore wind, 3 gigawatts of solar, and a fast growing part of the EDF Group. My particular part of EDF is in the UK, so I'm responsible for onshore wind and solar development. And we've also had a very fast growth over the last couple of years. We started out literally as 10 people 10 years ago. We now have about a gigawatt in operations. But really what's more interesting is really the forward growth that we project into the future, because we have a further 1.3 gigawatts of onshore wind in development in the UK, another 500 megawatts in Ireland. We're building an offshore wind farm, 900 megawatts of solar, and a very large battery portfolio as well. So we, like many other players in the industry, have going for a rapid growth phase. So back to the main part of my presentation this evening. Just wanted to reflect on as I was, like many of yourselves at the moment, when I left business school in 2002, I would not have believed about the amount of change that we've had in the industry over the course of about 20 years. And I'll talk through some of these stats in a moment. But there has been phenomenal change, which is for an MBA student, really exciting time to be part of the industry. And really the key message I've got for tonight is that we've had huge change in the last 20 years. I'm convinced the next 20, 30 years is going to see even more change as we move towards net zero. So if I look at the UK, and my apologies, my presentation is largely about the UK, but it is, I think, reflective of any country you could pick or many countries you could pick in the world. But in terms of the UK and the penetration of renewable electricity, we've seen this growth from 2002 from 3% through to 37% or 42% as we see today. If you include nuclear as well, at the moment in the UK, we have about 50% of our generation comes from low carbon sources. So it's a phenomenal growth that we've seen. And what's been driving this? A lot of it's been down to massive cost reduction across all the technologies. If you take solar, from 2002 through to today, we've seen about a 93% reduction in levelized cost of electricity, which is a phenomenal number. Onshore as well, minus 85% from 2002 through to today. Offshore, which is perhaps more in the public domain at the moment in the UK, has also seen massive cost reduction, but it's been more in the later years. And then the new kid on the block for many developers is battery storage. And again, we're seeing massive cost reduction. And I'll come back to some of these points in my later slides. So where are we today in terms of some of these technologies? Well, first one I want to talk about is onshore wind. Onshore wind has been was the first technology that really developed in the UK. There's a lot of growth, but it has become quite political in the UK. We had the renewables obligation, and then we had the first contracts for difference, which is the mechanism we have in the UK, and we had the first auction in 2015. But since then, more for political reasons, concerns around landscape, there have been no auctions since. We finally have an auction that's been promised for later this year, so very, very positive news. But there has been in the industry a pause, which has been quite frustrating for us, some of us that work in the industry. Very, very few projects have been built. In fact, some of the only projects being built have been built on a merchant basis, have been built by Greencoat. So it'll be great to hear more from James later this evening about how Greencoat's managed to do that. So what have developers been doing in this space? Well, what we've been doing is really focusing on reducing cost, really focusing on cost reduction. And that's largely through higher tip heights and going for larger projects. Just to illustrate this, I've got two examples from our portfolio, not big projects, but they are just typical of what we're doing. One of our projects is called Burnford East, a very small 3-turbine project. And we've managed to get that one to financial close by being able to sell all of the electricity to a supermarket, Tesco, that many of you will know. We also sold down in advance of the project being constructed to a financial investor to further improve the investment returns. And so these are the kind of things that we are now beginning to do to get projects over the line in the absence of some other structured deal from government. The other thing that we've been doing is working a lot to reconsent a lot of our projects. We found that most of our projects were more suitable for the old renewables obligation world. Now in a world where we have to be cost competitive, we found our projects are no longer competitive. So we had to take many of our projects back into the planning cycle. So here's an example. It was of Heathland. It was consented in 2018 at a tip height of 132 meters. We've just gone back into planning with tip height of 180 meters. And that is typical across the whole of the industry. Offshore. The amazing thing about offshore is just, again, what the cost reduction we've seen in recent years. The UK's Committee on Climate Change, which advises government on net zero climate change actions, they had forecasts for offshore wind costs going out to 2050. Those cost forecasts were beaten 30 years early through the most recent auctions in 2019. What's driving that cost? Well, it's larger turbines again, really big turbines that are now being developed in the order of magnitude of 15 megawatts per turbine, but also through improved installation methods, larger boats and those sorts of things. These large projects that are now being developed have attracted a lot of interest by a lot of players. We've seen more oil companies coming in. And in the most recent licensing round, which literally happened a couple of weeks ago in the UK, we saw BP, and it'd be great to hear from Dominic later to hear about that story. But they went in with record-beating bids to secure those the first couple of projects. The challenge, though, for offshore, it's not about technology; it's more about the environmental impacts. We've got a target in the UK for 40 gigawatts by 2030, but there are impacts that need to be managed regards birds, sand eels, and other environmental considerations. And so there is a need for decisions by government decision makers about what compromises are going to be made, what priorities are going to be made versus ecology versus the need for net zero. 80 gigawatts, 85 gigawatts has been suggested in the long term for floating offshore wind, for offshore in general. But I think floating is really the technology which is going to really take off to deliver a massive amount of offshore in the UK. I just got this one example, our project NNG. I just wanted to highlight this because this, like many projects, goes through quite a torturous process to get to financial close. This is a project that was developed by a company called Mainstream, got consent in 2014, won a contract for difference in 2015, but then was subject to a judicial review by the RSPB, is the charity in UK for birds. It finally cleared that judicial review in 2017 and managed to retain the rights for its CFD in that same year. I can assure you, for the Mainstream individuals involved in that, it was a very stressful period trying to get that project to a point where it's completely de-risked. And for them, they were very, very successful. So solar, I think you might be surprised to learn that solar is the 7th largest, the UK is the 7th largest solar market in the world. We're not exactly famous for our sun. What drove a lot of that growth in the early years was the subsidy regime. So a huge amount of solar was built out. When that subsidy regime came to an end, there was a complete collapse in the market, and solar then really dropped off. But as we've seen through further cost reduction, solar is now suddenly back on the agenda. And we're now seeing through a cost reduction and the fact that solar projects are generally relatively easy to develop compared to other technologies, we're seeing a huge amount of solar projects now coming to the market. So I was showing, so as I show in my slides here, we've gone from a pipeline in the UK of around 3 gigawatts of solar projects in 2018 to a staggering 14 gigawatts at the moment of projects going through the planning process, waiting to be built out. And we are finding with our own projects that often a good solar project is more competitive from a levelized cost of electricity point of view than an average onshore wind farm project. We're also potentially seeing the similar effect in the industrial commercial sector. So these are when people install solar on a rooftop and they consume the electricity directly. A lot of customer behavior is driving new demand, and we're seeing a lot of pickup of new projects. One of our projects, as a mini case study, is with Tesco's again. We're installing solar on a number of Tesco supermarkets. We're the owner and we sell the electricity directly to Tesco's under a long-term contract. It's a win for them, and it's a win for us. And then the final technology I just wanted to talk about is battery storage. Obviously, as more intermittents come onto into the system, there's more need to balance the market. And what we've seen is that the interest in electric vehicles has really driven a cost reduction in battery cell technology. So we, like many others, are investing in lithium-ion fast cycle battery storage projects. And similar to the story with solar, we're also seeing a lot of people coming in to the market. We've seen a large number of projects. So you can see by Q1 21, so right now, we've got about 16 gigawatts of projects which are in development. Only a gigawatt have been built out, but a huge pipeline of projects which are being developed and worked upon. The obvious challenge with battery storage is that the more battery storage projects that are out there, the less value there is to capture due to the cannibalization. So when you're going through your investment process, it is a challenge to make sure you've got your analysis just right. We have our own battery projects. Our first one was at West Burton. It was combined with built on with a CCGT. This purely provided frequency response service to the national grid. We then acquired a business called Pivot Power, which has got 40 battery sites, and we're already in the process of building out 2 sites, and we should announce news on the next 2 sites shortly. These are fully merchant energy arbitrage projects. So as you can imagine, we had to be pretty rigorous in our analysis to get ourselves comfortable to proceed with those projects. So how have we been? How successful have we been? In terms of the power sector, we've been very, very successful. As I've been talking about, we really have reduced the carbon emissions of our generation sector. Industry's done not so bad in terms of reducing emissions. That's largely through efficiencies, but also through a change in the mix of manufacturing in the UK. But other sectors have not been so successful. These are the hard to achieve, hard to get sectors. buildings is one that's particularly worth drawing out, because that's, I think, probably one of the hardest ones to address in the future. This slide here really does show the challenge of buildings. So what I've produced here, it's not my diagram, I've taken it from a different source. What I'm showing here is the amount of energy that it comes from natural gas in gigawatt hours. And this is the profile of energy that's needed from natural gas, which is largely used for heating. The red lines shows the energy from electricity. So if you were to completely electrify heat, you would need to follow this trajectory of following the blue line. And you can see the difference between summer and winter is quite phenomenal. And that really sums up the challenge that we have when looking at models to achieve net zero. And this is my last slide, but this has been studied. So UK government has produced their white paper very recently. They derive a lot of their analysis from the Climate Change Commission, and they are projecting that net zero can be achieved. And through their analysis, that they're suggesting that in order to achieve net zero, renewables would need to increase by a factor of 4. So that's a huge growth rate for renewables. But it also raises many other interesting questions, which I hope that you'll ask questions on later during today. So the question I've already tabled is, well, how do we decarbonize heat? Will it be through electrification, or will it be through low carbon hydrogen? In terms of transport, I think electric vehicles is probably going to be the dominant factor. But what would be the role for planes and shipping? Will hydrogen and ammonia maybe come forward? How we balance the system between summer and winter? How we balance this across the seasons? Will countries like UK rely more on interconnectors, more international trade? Will we use hydrogen and ammonia for storage, or maybe some other form of new technology storage? And what will be the role for carbon capture and underground storage? Will we carry on using natural gas for many years to come, but using carbon capture? So the industry has many, many challenges. And I think what challenges means is opportunities. So when as I said at the start of my talk, when I looked forwards from 2002 onwards, it was very difficult to see how the world would change. And things happened, like introduction of battery storage with lithium, but I would have thought unbelievable. But as we sit today and look forwards, I see also many things happening, and many things will happen that we probably can't even think about today. And I think for yourselves, as mainly business school students, that is a huge opportunity to get involved in. So I'll finish there, Marco. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you, Mark. And hi, everyone. It's great to be here. We started to have a lot of questions, so I'll try to probably bucket some of them together, and let's try to cover quite a few of them. So first, there's a few questions about the project. So one is about whether all solar and wind projects in the UK take market risk and are without subsidy. They ask about what is the length of the average length of PPAs, and then also if you have a strategy to engage local communities.
Yeah. Okay. I think with I mean, the market risk and contract length is a debate that's been happening for many years. I think it's very difficult for many investors to take a huge amount of market risk or merchant risk. So we at EDF, we can do it, but the investment hurdle is tough to realize. And as I said, there are a few companies that manage in the UK, Greencoat, which hopefully we'll learn more about later on. I think even Greencoat have got their limits in terms of what they can take on. So in order for investment to take place in either solar or onshore wind, somebody needs to take that long-term risk. So it's either going to be government through CFDs or ROCs, or it could be through corporate PPAs. And we are pursuing both. So we are due in the UK to have a pot 1, which will be an auction for both onshore wind and solar and other technologies in different parts. So this will happen. We're also very actively pursuing corporate PPAs, and I mentioned one with Tesco early in my presentation. Once you've got that long-term PPA, you can then get finance, you can then actually realize a project, but it is vitally important that that is there. In terms of a length, corporate PPAs that we look at, they typically range from about 10 to 15 years. Obviously 15 years is clearly better than 10 years. In terms of communities, community engagement is really, really important for all projects. For onshore wind farm projects, the consenting process takes many, many years. It starts off with bird studies and other things, and once a project becomes public, you then start speaking to local stakeholders. There are a number of tools, for want of a better word, that we use to talk about when we're speaking to local communities around community benefits, local jobs, potentially community investment that we're also looking at in our projects as well. So there are many positives to talk about regarding onshore wind. And what we're finding is in the locations where you do get onshore wind, which is largely Scotland at the moment, communities are broadly acceptable. And we are also beginning to see quite a bit of a change in the way that people react to onshore wind. Whereas projects 5 years ago would have been quite challenging when you go to a consultation process. What we're finding now is that they're less challenging. People get the need for net zero. So communities are becoming a lot more supportive than perhaps they were in the past.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, very clear answers. And maybe before we move to the panel, another question about battery technology. There's actually quite a few questions about that. One is about how important do you think that other technologies will be beyond Li-ion? And they mentioned supercapacitors or flow batteries. And connected to this, how do you manage the technology risk on batteries?
Yeah, of course. We, as EDF, are at the moment only investing in lithium-ion batteries, although we do have a small demo project with a flow battery at our project near Oxford. It's part of the Oxford Hub project. So we are investing in flow batteries as well. I think the way that we manage the technology risk is that we benefit a lot from a very strong R&D part of our business. So EDF is a big entity. And for many years, EDF has been investing in small batteries and testing them in R&D facilities mainly in France. And this has enabled us to have very, very good expertise and knowledge around batteries and how to go about the procurement process, the quality assurance process. So we've been able to get comfortable really mainly through experimenting and testing, vigorously testing technologies. As we do demo projects of other newer technologies, I guess we'll get more comfortable with those as well. But at the moment, the focus is more largely on, in terms of the scale of projects, largely on lithium-ion batteries.
Super, thanks, Mark. So I think I promise I'll bring forward some of these other questions to the panel, because we're lucky enough to actually have you in the panel as well. So I promise we'll cover some of these later. But I think we can transition to welcome the other guest speakers for today. I'll give you a brief introduction, which will not make justice to the full career. For who just connected, again, we have Mark, Director of Solar and Onshore Wind at EDF Renewables. We now also have Dominic Emery. Dominic is Chief of Staff at BP. In his long career, BP covered numerous roles, including leading business development in power and gas, running power and utility assets. And before the current role, he was running corporate venture strategy and policy activity. And beyond BP, he has also been the founding CEO of the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Climate Investment Fund. Welcome, Dominic, and thanks for joining us We also have Guy Turner. Guy is the founder and CEO of Trove Research. He has 30-year experience in research and strategy in sustainability and energy transition. After starting a career in consulting, he joined New Energy Finance, where he founded New Carbon Finance, then sold to Bloomberg. And in Bloomberg, he continued to serve as chief economist and head of commodities. And he recently had roles actually in EDF and BP. And as I mentioned, he's founded Trove Research. And we also have James Samworth. James is partner at Greencoat Capital, a 6 billion renewable infrastructure investor. And James specifically manages 800 million of assets specifically in bioenergy. And before joining Greencoat, James spent 11 years focusing on renewables and specifically bioenergy, and then before that in the steel industry. Many of them also have experience at LBS. James is also MBA alum. I think Guy also did a master course in LBS. So welcome everyone, and it's a pleasure to be able to moderate it today. And maybe we start with Dominic. And Dominic, we know that BP has set a new course, has aligned its strategy to net zero. So can you tell us a bit more about the plan? And specifically, we heard from Mark about the power sector, but what other low carbon opportunities is BP considering?
Thank you very much, Marco, and it's a real pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists and everybody who is on the Zoom. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this discussion. So really, just about a year ago, we did set a new direction. It was February the 12th, 2020, when we decided to change course, to set a new purpose for the company around reimagining energy for people and planet, and in so doing, set out a series of new aims to reach, to be a net zero company by 2050 or sooner. And of course, as soon as you do that, you end up kind of setting a kind of a discrete and very different new strategy. And some of the big components of those, I won't go into the kind of the details of the kind of the CO2 reduction intentions, but particularly in terms of the kind of the transition of the business, we set a course to move from an international oil company to an integrated energy company. And in so doing, set out a number of targets and aims around renewables development. In particular, by 2030, we aim to have 50 gigawatts of developed renewables. That's from a base of 2.5 gigawatts at the moment, in offshore wind, in solar, and in onshore wind. We also have plans around biofuels growth from currently around 20,000 barrels a day to about 5 times that number. Significant growth of vehicle electrification, that's, we think, going to be very, very important. And as was mentioned a little bit earlier by Mark, kind of the growth of that is something that we're really quite excited about. And then kind of somewhat longer dated, the opportunity around hydrogen. And I'm sure we'll come back to that over the course of this conversation. But I think the kind of the big deal for us was really around pivoting from being a pure kind of oil and gas company with a very modest renewables and alternative business to actually start that transition and actually start to redirect capital from our oil and gas businesses and our downstream businesses into renewables and alternatives in a much more substantial way. So by the time we get to 2025 or thereabouts, we should be investing about $5 billion a year. Now, that's not to say we still will be stopping oil and gas. This is not an overnight kind of cliff edge. This is a kind of a transition process. And still, we'll still retain, and we hope to retain, a very, very high quality oil and gas business over the coming decades. But we have said we will reduce production of oil and gas by about 40% by 2030. So this is a clear substitution strategy, moving away from oil and gas kind of predominance to one where we're substituting our oil and gas business for renewables, alternatives, and also for a convenience and mobility business led initially by electrification of transport. And then we think in due course into hydrogen and electricals. So Mark, I hope that gives you a bit of a sense as to the overall transition plans for the company.
Thanks, Dominic. And maybe moving to Guy, we heard about electricity and Dominic started to mention other low carbon areas. If we think about companies and governments aligning their target to net zero, what do we have to consider in terms of their trajectory and what they need to do in order to get there?
Yeah, thanks, Marco. I think, you know, as Mark and Dominic have said, there's a rapid change in technology at the moment, driving a lot of corporate investment. But it's really a function of both technology investment and the policy aims that governments are bringing to bear, and the trickle-down effect on companies. If you actually look at the state of international commitments, more than 60% of world emissions are now covered by governments either implementing or very close to implementing net zero commitments by 2050. And this has a sort of a profound trickle-down effect on policy, on R&D expenditure, and company commitments like BP. And in total, we've got over 1,000 global corporates now committing to net zero. And these companies are going to be increasingly held to account against these targets. There's a lot of influential stakeholders watching very closely when companies do make these commitments, that they follow through on them. And you're seeing them really thinking very hard about how they're going to hit these pathways, how much is going to be contributed by internal emission reductions through classic energy efficiency. Incidentally, about 40% of world infrastructure, clean energy infrastructure investing, is to do with energy efficiency, the good old faithful, as well as the more sort of glamorous sort of clean energy areas. As Dominic also sort of knows, and also at EDF as well, there's a significant growth in corporate venturing to invest in early stage technologies, to build new products. On the automotive side, companies like Jaguar now saying they're going to be building only electric cars by 2025. So there's both an internal emission reduction imperative facing a lot of companies, but also the opportunity and new product development is driving a lot of companies to reassess their business models. So I think we're going to see a profound change particularly in the next 10 years. And if you look what's happened to solar, PV, offshore wind, and lithium-ion battery storage, these technologies were sort of bumbling along, suddenly accelerated. The costs came down, the growth, the deployment rates skyrocketed. And as you get that combination of effects, a positive feedback sets in, and more growth develops lower costs, which develops more growth, which develops lower cost. And I think you can see similar trajectories starting to happen at the earlier stages in some of the other key technologies that we're seeing. And I think that those sort of pivot points, tipping points, are going to be really, really important to watch, because they will start to sort of permeate through the energy system and into corporate strategy as well.
Thank you, Guy. Coming to you, James, and in the financing landscape perspective, what do you think is the approach in order to channel capital to the opportunities and the needs of the energy transition?
So I want to take a slightly different perspective to the traditional kind of debt and equity or unlevered and their preferences, and perhaps go back a bit and think about the pools of capital that exist and their drivers. And I think the main pools of capital out there are pension funds, insurers, banks, high net worth individuals, and sovereigns. I think there are differences between all of them, but I think important characteristics you need to think about are, what are the liabilities these entities have? What are their durations? Are those liabilities inflation linked? Are they nominal? What's the kind of sponsor strength? What's the funding level of a scheme, for example, or balance sheet of an insurer like? Because that plays to the incentives of the managers or the trustees and kind of what's going to appeal to them. And what regulatory frameworks do they operate under? So Solvency II for insurers, or capital adequacy ratios for banks. That'll affect where they're relatively competitive or not, and what they can hold as a result. I think you've got that on one side of the equation. On the other, on the market side, obviously the energy market is going through this massive change that everyone's been speaking about, which is really restructuring things very fundamentally, and it's a big move in terms of energy markets from oil and gas and commodity-based markets to power, largely electrification being the dominant decarbonisation method. But power markets are commodity markets, but they're different commodity markets. And even within power markets, the old rules are changing. So, you know, in fossil generation, variable cost is huge and fixed cost is low-ish. And in renewables, fixed cost is large and variable cost is low, extremely low, you know, take your pick. And so those markets are going to change. And in some ways, the extremes are going to be more important. There was never a more vivid example than obviously Texas last week, which the Dean referred to, with $9,000 a megawatt hour price cap kicking in for 5 solid days, albeit that wasn't really an energy transition story. That was more an infrastructure resilience problem, although early days there. But I guess to bring it together, really, finance's job is to try and match those two and marry the opportunities in the market with the needs of your clients. But to our way of thinking, those are the important parameters to try and bear in mind when you're doing that.
Thank you, James. And as Mark mentioned, I think it would be great also to hear Greencoat's secret in why you've been, maybe you can tell us now why you've been so successful in recent years in your projects.
It's always scary because there's a small step from that to the kind of sole genius / madman. No, we're not the only idiots in town, I think. We may be one of the more visible at some of the subsidy-free renewables schemes that we've financed or acquired. I think what we tried to do is do our analysis carefully about what are the scenarios that are likely, probable, possible, and we try to understand the markets as well as we can, from the underlying commodity markets to you know, trends. Mark sort of touched on them in terms of price cannibalization and so on, and try to think about risks that we can take or not take that are actually quite binary. That sort of goes to the heart of, do you have a good asset, and is it within your fund's mandate, to things that you can price. I think what Mark was touching on in terms of merchant risk, and everyone has their limits, and he's right. But understanding what your about capacity to absorb shocks is or not, I think obvious statement coming up, but leverage reduces that capacity to absorb shocks. So we probably as a house are not particularly aggressive on gearing, and we don't pretend that we can predict the future unbelievably accurately, and we try to be realistic about what returns may be and how those look in a portfolio.
Thanks, James. And back to you, Mark. So we started to hear from everyone about the opportunities from the energy transition. We talked about electricity and also about batteries with you. What is your and EDF's view about hydrogen and some of the other exciting technologies that are emerging?
That's probably the hardest questions you could ask at this point in time. I don't think anyone really truly knows what the future holds for hydrogen. There are lots and lots of views. I think there are thousands of conferences you can go to at the moment for hydrogen, and the interest in hydrogen has really picked up in the last 12 months. I don't know if it's because of COVID and working at home, everyone started reflecting on it, but hydrogen really has just exploded in terms of interest in the last 12 months. But the future's not proven. I think what's interesting about hydrogen, why people are getting excited, is first of all that for many assets, particularly renewable energy projects, it's an alternative way to get your electricity out. So rather than building a a grid connection line to the very far north of Scotland or to some project far offshore, you can export your energy in the form of hydrogen. And that's interesting because you can then sell your hydrogen potentially into a global market. I think the second reason why hydrogen is very interesting is it's a commodity that can be stored more easily than pure electricity. So lithium-ion batteries is all about fast cycle. It's balancing the day to the day or second to second. It's not about week to week or season to season. And hydrogen and its cousin ammonia has the potential to store energy over long periods of time. But how exactly that market rolls out is really uncertain. And the role of what's called blue hydrogen versus green hydrogen, blue hydrogen being hydrogen that's derived from natural gas with the carbon being captured, green hydrogen obviously coming from renewable electricity and other low carbon generation like nuclear. It's very uncertain exactly how that's going to pan out. And one of the questions that we don't truly know what the future holds is how, for example, will we be having many houses with hydrogen being piped to the front door? It is a possible scenario. It's a scenario that the UK is investing a lot of R&D money on, but it's not necessarily the only scenario. So you could imagine in 10, 15 years time that what we thought was hydrogen was going to be used for gets completely overtaken by some other new technology, some other form of energy storage that just completely takes that away. So to answer your question, what's our strategy? Well, we're like everyone else, we're following it very closely. We've got a couple of projects up our sleeve that we want to pursue. They're more demo projects rather than massive big projects. And we're seeing how it goes. I mean, I think Guy talked about tipping points. I totally agree with him. In terms of cost of electrolysis and efficiency of electrolysis, if the technology really takes off, you may suddenly find that hydrogen becomes more competitive than perhaps what we thought. So I think really, really uncertain. Yeah, interested to hear what the other panelists say about hydrogen.
Well, thanks, Mark. And I guess we could run a whole panel about hydrogen for how interesting it's becoming. But maybe Dominic, can you add a bit more from your perspective on your view on the opportunity from hydrogen?
Yes, certainly. Mark is right. It's difficult to predict. I think getting demo projects kind of up and running and building confidence in the market is going to be very important. And actually seeking to build full scale, if you like, kind of supply demand projects is going to be important, rather than just hoping a market will kind of materialize. Now, there is a market for hydrogen at the moment. It's used in refining, it's used in kind of fertilizers, so it exists, but it has to be grown by kind of probably 2 orders of magnitude in order to potentially contribute to, as the Hydrogen Council have suggested, as the UK Energy Transmissions Commission have suggested, perhaps up to 20% of end-use energy by the middle of the century. The other interesting thing about hydrogen from our perspective is that it's actually a building block for a lot of things. It's a building block for future electrofuels, for example, and it can be produced in a number of ways, and it also has a number of different use cases. Clearly, heat, domestic heat potentially, certainly industrial heat where you need very high-grade heat for industrial processes, potentially for long-distance transportation on road, and potentially marine transportation, either as hydrogen or as ammonia. So it's an important building block. There are a number of different use cases, and it can be created in a number of different ways. So it seems to me that it has a kind of potential as a critical kind of renewable or low carbon building block point forward. I think as Guy was pointing out, the costs of electrolyzers are coming down dramatically. The cost of renewable power is coming down dramatically. And you start kind of overlapping those Venn diagrams, and it makes the production of green hydrogen in certain jurisdictions where you've got very high insulation and or very high kind of wind quality, and you can bring down the cost of renewable power alongside electrolyzers quite compelling. But there is ways to go. So I think we're probably looking at kind of real materialization of hydrogen opportunities into the kind of the 2030s with large scale demonstration probably over the next decade, really to kind of prove the point. But I think confidence building is really important. I think if the world chose to do so, it could really bring kind of hydrogen into being. It's not a slam dunk, but we're pretty excited about it. And I think Mark's point about there being a multitude of conferences, you can't really move for hydrogen conferences these days. But I think it's an exciting possibility, particularly to companies like ours, which demand huge kind of integrated engineering projects, the kind of thing that we would consider ourselves kind of good at. We think we would like to take, we've said publicly we'd like to kind of take something like 10% of the future hydrogen market. So we've put a bit of a marker out there as to where we'd like to get to.
Well, that's ambitious and exciting. And I'll stay with you, Dominic, because I think hydrogen is a good example of the uncertainty that also there is in transitioning to net zero and charting new strategies. So can you tell us a bit more about the challenges of a new strategy and like transitioning a company toward net zero?
Well, I'll start by actually saying the opportunities of the transition, because there are lots of challenges, but the opportunities is phenomenal. If you just kind of stand back and think about the investment levels that will be required in order to get to net zero. We've had a number of different kind of reports out. The recent IEA report suggests that it's going to cost, or the investment opportunity, as we might like to call it, is something. It's the order of $100 trillion over the next 30 years. So maybe kind of $3 trillion per year to 2050. And you have to say, well, that's a very exciting opportunity to invest into. So that's it, if you like, a kind of a bit of a macro picture, and taking an optimistic view of the opportunity is where we'd kind of rather be, rather than kind of chasing shadows around kind of risks and difficulties. But being absolutely kind of serious, I think Guy and Mark and James have spoken about the different sort of components to bring this into reality. One is the kind of technology, and there's some technologies that are now being proven are coming down the cost curves. That's very exciting. The second is really around kind of policy and regulatory frameworks and enabling those to facilitate speeding up of consenting processes for offshore wind is a good example. And also take electric vehicles to ensure open systems and interoperability of electric vehicle systems. Again, that's the sort of thing that will help to kind of speed up. And then per James, really, it's around the kind of financial markets that are becoming much more excited about this opportunity. We hope it's kind of not a bubble, but again, a little bit like with hydrogen, never a day goes by without a kind of green bond conference of some sort going on somewhere. So I think everything is kind of pointing in the right direction. But the kind of missing ingredient is really around kind of, I think, both leadership at the kind of the corporates and at the country level, being prepared to kind of make that kind of stand, drive, shape, and create new markets. And also, as we hope to see in Glasgow, more political leadership in terms of ratcheting up those NDCs to something that at least approximates kind of well below 2 degrees, let alone kind of net zero. So I think political will, and the transfer, frankly, the wealth transfer that simply has not happened since Paris of $100 billion a year to the developing world to help support the transition. So they're the three components. I think technology is looking good. I think policy and regulation is kind of working in some countries. I think, again, the financing is really kind of moving ahead with pace. I think both political leadership is definitely what we need here, and hopefully we'll get it as we come up to Glasgow.
So I'll warn you, I will ask you before the end, what is your wish for COP26 in Glasgow? So you can start thinking about it. Guy, Dominic just mentioned the importance of creating new markets. Can you tell us a bit more about carbon offsetting and carbon markets, and what do you think about their legitimacy, some of the challenges that lie there?
Yeah, sure. Well, if you can't move for hydrogen conferences, you certainly can't move for carbon conferences these days as well. There's an awful lot of work going on in this field to address issues around legitimacy, and there are sort of three components to legitimacy. The first is, under what conditions should companies aspire to using them? What are the efforts that companies are going to make reduce their emissions internally before they resort to the carbon offsets? And when along that journey should they be looking to make use of offsets? There are certain concerns that some companies have just rushed to claim a carbon neutral end goal by buying up some pretty weak quality offsets and then claiming victory. And then sort of thirdly, how do you define what quality is from a carbon offset? And the devil is in the detail. But the sort of single message I would want to sort of bring out is, given all the work that is going on, there's the Mark Carney task force on scaling carbon markets, there's lots of other initiatives that also we're involved with, that are really now shining a spotlight on some of these sort of cottage industry sort of practices that went on before, really trying to professionalize them and really drive ambition, both on the demand side, but also quality on the supply side. And there's a whole host of technical and accounting issues that come into play. In terms of market opportunity, we estimate that the market is going to grow to potentially $10 to $25 billion a year in terms of traded market by 2030, and maybe $100 billion a year by 2040. But if those numbers are going to have a real impact on carbon reductions, we do have to address the issue of integrity. And again, a lot of work is certainly going on in that field.
Thanks, Guy. James, so we started to see a lot of questions about new technologies, but we actually know that a large part of the solution to the climate challenge lies in the deployment of existing technologies. What do you think are some of the challenges from a financing point of view to really get to an accelerated pace of adoption of existing available technologies?
So it's one of the endless sort of conference questions of, is there a shortage of money or a shortage of good projects? And I think what we've shown in the last decade is that you can finance good quality, well-structured projects where you have the right technical solutions, the right policy, the right structures, and the right skills to deliver them. I think you're right. Certainly to get to 80% of reduction in emissions from 1990 levels or whatever your baseline is, we know pretty much most of the answers. We know how to decarbonize the power sector. We just need to get on and do it. We know that electric vehicles are going to do light transport. We know a fair bit about heating and other industry. And then I think to the question about why now in terms of hydrogen, getting from 80% to 100% is very difficult. We certainly don't know all the answers for that leg of the journey yet, and there are several runners and riders, and that'll influence what we do. I think to Dominic's point about leadership, that can come down to actually some quite granular things like planning rules for onshore wind. The cheapest technology in the market is kind of off the market in the UK to a large extent, or to a greater extent than should be the case. I think power markets have to be structured right. I mean, Texas was a very vivid example of one that clearly isn't. Getting market structures, policies, and incentives right is really fundamental for people making long-term 30, 40-year investment decisions. And that it's the same in all infrastructure, but policy credibility and ultimately governmental, that can be regional, state, or even local, is very, very important. I think that's actually where net zero has been very helpful. Once you figure out that it isn't about the emissions per year, it's about the total stock of emissions, the aggregate total that we have ever emitted. That's what sets the warming level. It doesn't really matter how long you emit them over. You've just got a budget, and if you spend more, then it'll be warmer, and that's what it is. Once you make that mental shift and you realize we've got to stop, and once you realize we've got to stop, then that makes the policies that say we've got to stop much more credible, and people can then start to plan around that because there's actually a science backing things up. So yes, there are different views and there'll be different NDCs and so on about whether we should be aiming for 1.5, pretty tricky from where we are now, 2, still quite ambitious, 2.5, you know, we'll see where the consensus shakes out. But once we have those policies and drivers, I believe we have the technologies to do 80% of the job, and I think we'll have the financing structures behind them. Beyond that, I mean, there'll be an interesting careers for a lot of people on this call, I think, to work out the second half of that journey.
And actually, that's I think that's a good conduit, because I think, like, before we get to other more technical questions, I think it's good for everyone to hear your opinion about careers in energy, career in energy transition, in climate action as well. So maybe we start with you, Mark, your LBS alum, and I think there was a question also before saying, basically, what did the MBA give you? What skills do you need today to pursue a career in this field?
Yeah, no, I think what the MBA does give you a huge amount of relevant skills, because I think at the heart of what I do is that financial investment decision. It's taking a project, going through the de-risking, the planning, the de-risking process. But ultimately, at the end of the day, to get a project over the line, it's a financial investment decision. So you need to have those rounded skills and be able to understand financial models, as well as the more technical skills around the procurement, the technology, and everything else. So I think it gives you. I've really have benefited from the toolkit that I got from London Business School. I've also benefited from quite a diverse career. I've worked on strategy, I've worked on regulation, I've worked on many different types of technologies, and I think the MBA education gives you that confidence to be able to jump ship into different areas. So there's been a number of times in my career where I've been advised by experts not to join offshore wind, because offshore wind is not a technology that's going to take off. And I've thought, I'm just going to do it anyway. And I think you know, going to go on a business school gives you that confidence to believe that you can make something of it, can make a big impact.
Thanks, Mark. And a question for Dominic, also related to careers, is energy has traditionally been a capital-intensive sector with less entrepreneurship probably than other sectors, also because of that, and probably other factors as well. Do you think this is changing today? And do you feel there is more space for entrepreneurship in energy?
I do. And one thing that we've really been delighted about over the last kind of decade or so has been the development and growth of our corporate venture capital business, which has been seen about $500 million worth of investment into, I wouldn't call them startups because they're a little bit more mature than pure startups, but into a whole range of different energy opportunities, upstream, downstream, renewables, some conventional opportunities as well. And I think that's really created a super backcloth of entrepreneurship for people coming into that team. We've subsequently kind of grown that to develop a new thing called the Launchpad, which is intended to try and scale new kind of business opportunities, new business models, new technologies kind of really quickly. And I think this, the whole opportunity around sort of integration between, for example, renewable power and hydrogen, again, provides a wonderful new kind of playground for entrepreneurial engineers, shall we say. So I do think the world is quite different. But ultimately, for us, there will still be a lot of kind of capital intensive. I mean, in many ways, renewables will be more capital intensive than conventional fossil fuels, because clearly there are no kind of fuel costs into renewables. So capital intensity will always be there. Big integrated projects will always be there. But I would say the times are even more exciting for kind of young aspiring engineers, particularly those with the kind of financial capabilities that Mark was talking about, the ability to recognize a quality project from from a poorer project, and the ability to understand and assess risks. So yeah, we're very excited about recruitment into our new businesses, and also continued flow of talent into our more entrepreneurial venturing and launchpad businesses.
Thanks, Dominic. Really exciting. Guy, what's your view?
Well, just to build on Dominic's point, I think as well as sort of like ingenuity and creativity, I think what this industry needs more than anything now is visionaries. And I think LBS certainly gives you that very, very powerful global perspective and long-term thinking. And so if you look where Elon Musk has taken Tesla, that didn't necessarily happen by noodling over spreadsheets. That came from hugely ambitious visions. But now it's the most valuable car company in the world, I believe. And at a sort of slightly, more local level, ITM Power announced recently that it's building a gigawatt electrolyzer business factory in Leeds, which was dropping the unit cost of electrolyzers by 40%. The transitions that we need to make, the leaps we need to make, won't necessarily come through increments. They're going to have to require bold decisions that need to be backed up by technology and finance, but the vision needs to be there to make those bigger leaps as well.
Thanks, Guy. And also your view, James, because ultimately a lot of MBAs want to work in finance. What is your advice for their career?
So I think I'm aware now, so I left LBS in 2009, and so my journey was mine and carries on, but the market's very, very different to how it was when I was job hunting in 2008, quite apart from Lehman Brothers and so on. But renewables is a much larger business, 10x what it was then, and it's a much more sophisticated business, and that goes to what you need in various roles. I think I've always been a bit of a believer in the kind of T-shaped profile type. You have to find the things that you're really, really good at, because there are a lot of people who are ambitious and want to work in this industry for all the reasons we've outlined. It's a very exciting place to be. It's parts of it are clearly growing very fast. It's clearly fundamental to everybody's everyday life. And the way society runs, and so building that depth of expertise, that an MBA is a good start in and can be part of a journey towards. But I think people need to really take the time to develop serious expertise so that they can really succeed. Because the way the world's going, it's easier and easier for more people to compete across more areas, and it's a little bit more kind of winner takes all. So you have to stand out and to really find something that you excel at. And that may seem, when you're starting out, that it can be a bit niche, but I think it's very, very hard to be a real generalist today in renewables markets.
And if I may add from my point of view as well on this, I find it extremely exciting and rewarding to work in this sector, but I fully agree. If I can make the analogy with digital, you cannot be a digital expert anymore. You cannot be a climate expert anymore. It's becoming so wide that it's important that you develop specific expertise. So we're now happy to take a question. So please keep feeding them on the Q&A tool. And be patient with me. I'll try to put them forward to our speakers. I've seen one question, Dominic, probably for you, which is about the competitive landscape and how that is changing, in the sense that you have oil and gas companies, oil and gas majors that are looking to play, for example, in renewables. At the same time, you have tech companies, and the example was the one of Tesla, which is probably something in between tech, energy, automotive, and other things. But definitely the are blurring in between sectors. What is your view, and what are the main challenges for BP?
I think that's right. There's definitely been a real blurring at the edges, and our traditional competitor set would be Total, Shell, Exxon, Chevron. But we are starting to see the kind of if you like, a kind of a bleed across into sort of other competitor groups. And so our competitor analysis team now does a lot more work on the likes of understanding kind of Ørsted's business model, also understanding, you know, the growth of next era energy and Iberdrola, and of course EDF and others, so that we can get a better sense of kind of direction of travel for some of these very, very large utilities. I think we do recognize within our kind of discrete competitor set, there are kind of two broad business models. One is those companies that are wishing to kind of transition. So the likes of Shell, Total, BP, Equinor, Eni, Repsol in Europe, and Chevron and Exxon, who are preferring, because they believe that's the kind of the right business model, kind of to stick to being great oil and gas producers. And Exxon just a couple of weeks ago announced the developments of their kind of new kind of CCS unit, which I'm sure will be very scaled and very exciting. And then you have, let's say, smaller players that have a very interesting business model, like Oxy. And actually, it's relevant to one of the questions that was posed actually in the session just now, which is Oxy are using kind of anthropogenic CO2, re-injecting that into oil fields, producing more oil, and just recently sold a cargo of carbon neutral oil, which had the CO2 neutralized kind of from production right through to combustion of the product through CO2 re-injection. So it's a legitimate but a kind of a different business model. But I think the short answer is we are seeing big change. Total isn't even called Total anymore. It'll be Total Energies, assuming it gets voted through at their AGM, I think. And so we are seeing a real kind of variety and push into diversification. And I know one of our kind of beliefs is that calling ourselves an integrated energy company is not just a kind of slogan, it's actually important because we think we can make frankly, kind of a big deal of the kind of the integration opportunities between the likes of renewables and between the likes of natural gas and hydrogen. And that's where we see opportunity. We also see opportunity in not just in the kind of physical integration, but also the trading opportunities around assets, around electrons and around molecules. So that integration component is going to be important. I think we'll start to differentiate the integrated energy players from the pure players point forward. And I think it's fair to say we've seen the purer players like Ørsted and offshore wind now looking to migrate into hydrogen. We're actually doing a kind of a desktop study with them on hydrogen opportunities around our Lingen refinery in northern Germany. So I think your point is right, Marco. We are seeing much more kind of blurring at the edges, particularly in the kind of diversifying European oil and gas majors.
And maybe coming to your perspective, Mark, from the perspective of EDF, there is a question also related to competitive landscape, and is about how do you partner with the external ecosystem? They mentioned the tech companies. Does the approach need to change to how you interact with a broader ecosystem and competitors?
Yeah, I think the area where we are increasingly I guess collaborating with technology companies is probably more on the customer side. I think that what we've not really discussed a lot this evening is the technology on demand side management and managing technology in the home to help manage customers' demand. Because I talked about the peaks and troughs and the challenge of providing the energy, say during the winter, but the other way to manage that is on the customer side. So there's a lot of small companies which are working on technology, be it on the IT side of things or on the optimization of a battery project, all those sorts of things. So we're spending a lot of time, not my part of the business, but I know my sister companies are spending a lot of time working with smaller companies in this new space.
Thanks, Mark. Another question came about policy and regulation and about the challenges. And so maybe Guy, you can give a bit of a perspective in terms of what do you see as the main challenges or issues that could be from a regulatory standpoint?
Is that related to the power markets or more broadly?
I think it's general. So obviously now the Europe, UK, and also globally, we start to see an increase in ambition in the targets, or at least saying getting to net zero. From a regulatory standpoint, what are going to be the main challenges?
Well, let me start with a sort of a market that but that James and Mark are going to be familiar with, and that's the regulation of the power market. And as I think, as James said, the moving from a marginal cost pricing model, wholesale market, into a market with much lower prices driven by greater penetration of low marginal cost technologies creates a headache for regulators to reward the investment through capacity payments or what other sort of fixed payment mechanisms are required to try and get the capacity built and have the efficiency of allocation through a market mechanism, when actually the market ceases to provide the financial incentives you need to reward the investment in the first place. So the contracts for difference we have for renewable energy assets and the capacity payments are sort of providing sort of a lot of headaches for regulators to organize, and that sort of like low marginal cost of delivery is a pervasive challenge. So I think that's a big one. There are other allocation challenges. So on vehicles, renewable electric vehicle infrastructure charging, where we have scarce assets around charging infrastructure. Dominic, I don't know if this sort of comes, or Mark, this comes through into your work, but are there challenges in allocating capacity to private sector firms where there is competition for those assets? Say nodes on a motorway network, for example. We know that the allocation of assets for offshore wind in the auction process that the UK government ran was challenging for them, and trying to figure out what prices to pay for those assets. So I think where there's a lot of money chasing government-owned assets or publicly owned assets, there are issues around how to allocate those through market mechanisms. I think those are sort of regulatory challenges that we need to grapple with.
Thanks, Guy. And I'm conscious we're getting to the end of the panel. So maybe, I don't know if you can say, each of you, what would be your wish for COP26 later in the year. Maybe Guy, you want to start?
My wish for COP26 is countries to turn up with materially improved nationally declared contributions, nationally determined contributions to where they were 5 or 6 years ago. So we need to be reducing emissions at a rate of about 7.5% a year, every year, between now and 2030, 2035. That's a huge, huge ask. And the Paris Agreement was built around a voluntary ratchet process. And this is the first real acid test of that can countries turn up and say, we have materially increased our ambition from where we were 5 years ago.
Thanks. Dominic?
Well, Guy kind of said it. That's exactly what my wish would be. And so I'll have a second wish, which is I would hope we could get kind of sorted out on kind of Article 6 and in particular kind of carbon trading, more kind of carbon markets and trading more kind of globally. That would be my second wish, which I hope would contribute to that ratcheting up of NDCs towards a kind of net zero by 2050.
James?
So it's perhaps not so much a wish, just a piece of context, but COVID-19 last year obviously radically transformed our whole economy. Substantially no foreign flights, UK power demand down to levels that I think for pretty much 100 years I mean that little power demand on the system, etc., etc., etc. The net effect on carbon emissions was about a 7% reduction on 2019. That's what we've got to do every year for 30 years to hit net zero. It was a real kind of wow moment. So to think that we can achieve this through kind of consumer behavior change around the edges is just fantasy. This is a wholesale restructure of the way that we power and fuel society. And we really, really, really need to see it through that lens. And countries, corporates, asset owners, financiers, and civil society at large has really got to realize what the stakes are here.
Dominic?
I'm sorry, I'll follow up James's point because he's absolutely right. Nibbling around the edges on the kind of demand side isn't going to cut it. We really, so we in the kind of, in terms of kind of the generators and the infrastructure kind of providers, we kind of have to be there to give consumers a kind of a completely different choice. Expecting the kind of customers to come to the rescue is cloud cuckoo land. And as James rightly says, we've seen something like a 7% reduction in CO2 emissions through the kind of the terrible global pandemic, and we need 7% reductions per year between now and 2050. So it's a complete replumbing and rewiring of the world's energy system.
Mark, your view?
I think I'm not going to say particularly on COP26, but what I'd like is the government, UK government, to use COP26 as a reason to be really bold on some leadership points. For us to be able to build out the amount of low carbon generations that's needed, we need some big decisions. And these are around things like planning. Trying to get projects through planning process is challenging and takes many, many years. Trying to get grid connections in the UK for certain parts of the country is really, really challenging. So you've got Ofgem who have got a criteria to protect the customer, who at times are reluctant to allow anticipatory investment in our grid infrastructure. So there needs to be bold government leadership to unlock the renewable technologies that we've got available to us. So let's use COP26 as an excuse to make that happen.
Thanks, Mark, and thanks everyone for this wish list, if you want. And if I may add a parting thought before TAC closes, I think it's just incredibly exciting, right? If we have to get down 7% per year, if we have to change our whole society. So I think like for everybody who joined today, it's very exciting to think about careers in this space, whether it's entrepreneurship, finance, corporates, consulting, or others. So yeah, really, really exciting. And obviously we have to get there. So we need everyone. Okay, back to you, TAC. And I just want to thank Dominic, James, Mark, and Guy, and actually you organizers as well, and everybody who joined. I think it was very, very interesting from my point of view.
Thank you, Marco, Guy, Dominic, James, and Mark. This was a very exciting panel we had today. Energy transition is gaining attention day by day. And from today's session, we have so many learnings and insights we can think on throughout this year. Thank you also to the audience for attending. We hope you enjoyed today's session as much as we did. I have just included in the chat a quick survey that will only take 2 minutes of your time. It means so much to us to hear from you your feedbacks. For tomorrow, we will have day 2 of the Global Energy Summit. The keynote speech from the CEO of Quake Petroleum International will cover shifts in the geopolitical landscape. A roundtable discussion following that will cover energy transition in the Middle East. The event will start from 6 o'clock and the links will be sent out in the email as it did today. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow and we hope you enjoy the rest of the evening. Thank you very much.